Thank you for tuning in to the World Builder's Anvil, episode 230. Today, a deep dive into the death rites of primitive religions.
Orcs.
Like an orc religion, or?
Orcs. Orcs read the episode.
What?
Orcs read the episode. Orcs take over the episode. It will be an episode about orcs.
I thought we talked about, we were going to do a religious episode about death
Birthday.
rites.
My birthday. We talk orcs, even though they don't talk like this.
So we're not doing the religious.
Orcs.
Okay, sorry guys, I guess because it's Jeff's birthday, we're talking about orcs.
Don't know where to start building your fantasy world?
Do you need more? Does it make sense?
Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination.
This is the place where we will prime your mind.
Now, it's time to heat up the forge.
Break out the mithril ingots and hammer.
Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And I'm Michael Miller.
Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome back. As always, I'm the humble and non-assertive Jeffrey W. Ingram.
Compromisingly yours. I am Michael Miller.
That's right. You're going to compromise.
Happy birthday, Jeff.
Okay, this is one I know we've talked about orcs a few times, and maybe even a little bit about the orcs of my world.
Have we?
But as in third-party elements, right? So, like, I know we talked about Buardrakkeniem culture, which I don't know if you were on the show at that point or not. We've done so many episodes. Likelihood is you were on the show at this point, so but it's hard to say. But I know I've talked a little bit about the Buardrakkeniem culture, and to talk about them, I have to talk about the orcs, which, if you know Jeffrey, you would know that this is Jeffrey's favorite race. I would only ever be able to answer the question, am I elf or orc today, by saying I am orc. That is actually
the irony is that I know Jeffrey, and I did not know orcs were your favorite. I would have thought goblins were.
A lot of people, just because my take on goblins was neat, they think I like goblins. No, I like orcs. Because in a way, when I developed orcs in my world, I wanted to capture like the feeling from an outsider of orcs from lore. So this idea that you have this evil horde going to come down on wargs and raid and destroy everything. And I can see where to an outsider they would appear that way. But, if you ask the orcs, the humans are the bad guys in the story. And so for me, I love the orcs. They really symbolize to me sort of my idea of trying to twist what people expect into my own thing. And I really like them. And I think it's an interesting thing to look at because my orcs, I have two races of orcs on my world. You could maybe argue three, but I would say two of them are the same essential like racial makeup. They have different cultures, but as a race, they're one creature. And then there's another version. And a lot of it kind of goes back to the history of the world and stuff like that. So it's a really interesting one. I thought out several races pretty well, but orcs and humans have been the two most common occurrences in my storytelling, just because of typically where it takes place. They are the two most predominant things that you will likely run into.
Now, before I let you get too large of an orcgasm, too large of an orcgasm, I would like to do some shout outs here. So let me open up this.
Well, it's for the Undercroft, so that is an awesome reason to interrupt my birthday.
And I might, some of these people I may have shouted out already, but again, in the interest of making sure no one gets missed, so some people may be getting double shout outs. I'll go back to the middle of May. So we have welcome to the Fantasy World Builders Undercroft, Ryan, Christina, Logan, Darissa. Oh yeah, Darissa I seem to remember, so I think I've mentioned these people before. Wow, I'm going to try this name, but I apologize because I'm probably going to say it wrong. Kalachu? It's C-A-L-E-U-C-H-E. Mm-hmm. So welcome to the group. I apologize if I'm butchering your name. I imagine I am. And Robert. So thanks for joining the Fantasy World Builders Undercroft, guys.
And Robert, same thing. If you screwed up your name, just let us know and he'll fix it next time.
I'll try. Do my best. So, orcs. Where do you want to start?
Where do I want to start? I want to start with why I want to talk about orcs. And Michael and I were actually talking about this, and we had not too long ago just spent several episodes talking about gnomes. And gnomes are really cool, and I like doing that. But I wanted to bring up orcs because to me, this kind of gets into sort of my idea of naturalistic framework building. Because it was sort of one group that became two, and then three cultures kind of spring out of it. And so I think that'd be interesting to look at because of that. And in a way, there's another group that you could argue is a race. I would say probably not quite smart enough to be a race, but they are closely coupled in.
What do you mean they're not smart enough to be a race?
Not orcs. I'm saying there's another race.
No, I realize you weren't talking about orcs, but I'm just trying to get you to clarify. So they're not smart enough, so they're just like a creature.
They're a very smart creature. They're not quite up to the level that I would call sentient.
Fair enough.
But they're probably more clever than wolves. Probably in the arena of tuna. Actually, I don't know how intelligent tuna is, so I'll go to dolphins. I always get those two confused, like a good fisherman, which I'm not.
I don't think dolphins are fish. Pretty sure they're mammals.
Dolphins are mammals, but fishermen will often catch them in their nets when they're trying to capture tuna.
Oh, I know, but that basically just tells us how bad of a fisherman you are because you don't even know the difference.
Listen, I caught one and it was this big. I didn't even raise my hands. It's an audio podcast. I didn't have to.
I know what's funny though is like when he said that, I looked up at the camera, and he's not putting his hands up, which he should have, which would have added to it. So I think it's funnier that you didn't.
Mm-hmm. So
it was this big.
But I think it's an interesting one to look at because this really kind of goes into my mindset for how I think through these types of things. Now, these are ones that are largely built already. There's no real reason to recapture some of them, but I want to talk about some of the key things and why they developed the way they did. And so the idea was, for me, orcs started off in the mountains, much like they do in like lots of fiction. Hordes come from mountains. Now, I didn't leave it quite at that because if you know the setup of the world Gardul, you know that there's a massive area that makes it very easy for steppe and nomadic people to do very well over a vast swath of the continent. And there are a couple isolated areas that are tougher for them to get to. So I get some of the transformations going through, but I have very large, powerful steppe nomads. And they're not all necessarily steppe. There's some desert nomads too because of the conditions of the planet in certain spots. But a large swath where growing an agrarian civilization is trying because you have these guys who, if you're weak enough, will come in and steal your stuff. They won't settle in your cities. Occasionally, they might lord over you for a little bit, but typically it doesn't last very long because they don't typically have the troop strength to deal in a one-on-one battle with most agrarian civilizations, have more food and more soldiers, but they're much faster because they're a nomad. So my orcs very early on in their evolution kind of took two paths. They started up in the caves in the mountains near the center of the world where a lot of my races sort of started from, right near some humans who actually would become the Buardrakkeniem. So the Buardrakkeniem were actually forming at the base of the mountains very early on in prehistory. And right higher up are these orcs who would come down and raid them. And then over time,
those humans are trouble.
Yeah. And so the interesting thing and the sort of development was very early, some of the orcs were really excited about the being off the mountains because the problem is coming up and down out of the mountains is a lot more dangerous type of maneuver to do a raid in. If you don't have a complete surprise, you're going to have a bad day. But on open plains, moving around, is much simpler. So initially they came down on wargs, and many of those types of orcs started adopting other types of mounts, like horses and camels, sort of depending on where they're at in the world. and what was a more effective mount for being on the open plains, where wargs are fast, horses are faster in my world. So there was wargs are kept around, and there's a traditional element to them in Orcish culture, but for the plains. But they have adapted a lot of horses and camels on top of that, especially in their steppe tribal ways. Now, the ones in the mountains, on the other hand, the wargs and them kind of very much grew together the entire time. So very much a codependent type of species, right? They need the wargs to interact the way they interact, which is they have a couple different places that they shelter. They actually have villages that are very tough to get to. You would actually physically have to climb up a cliff to get to them. They've bred the wargs to be very good at digging in and climbing rocks. So they're very effective mounts in mountains where horses are horrible. But on the other hand, because of the changes and the early separation of this, I sort of have this group of mountain orcs and a group of, I just call them orcs. But they typically grew up as a more steppe tribes. And so in my brain at that point is different survival traits are needed to survive. Ergo, they become different. The ones in the mountains have a lot more focus around skills and physical prowess to survive in really, really nasty conditions. Their summer home, where they raid out of, is very hard to get to, and you pretty much can't grow crops. So they have to steal or bring to their lairs that which will get them through the winter. They actually have a secondary home that they will retreat to in the winter. And I don't want to get too much into the cultures at this point, but they live in very, very tough conditions. Religiously, the orcs in the plains would separate very early and start moving more towards the gods of the people on the plains. So there are some goblins and humans that also do that kind of activity. And down there's actually a lot more multicultural type of stuff going on where orcs, humans, and goblins can all kind of intermingle. Higher up, they're a bit more xenophobic, not only of races, but of other orcs. If you're not part of the family, they don't know you, they can't trust you. They live in very harsh conditions. They have a very tenuous relationship with their gods because the weather's horrible, and typically cultures that have bad weather have tough, mean gods. They actually don't even worship the gods directly. They try and stay away from them as much as they can. Now, there are a lot of spirits of nature that they do worship, and there's some ancestor worship as well too, which ends up getting tied more once again into the wargs, where ancient ancestors that were worthy would be brought back and bound to wargs, which would give the wargs smarter than human, or they get wargs orcish intelligence, which kind of makes them sentient. But over time, the spirit merges with the warg,
and
it's
like a magic thing.
Oh, magically, yes, like a spirit magic used to take the spirit of an ancestor and place it into a warg.
Okay.
And so over time, what happens is that's how the wargs get so smart. But over time, the longer the spirit is connected to the warg, the animal and the ancestor spirit kind of merge into one, and it loses its advantage. But still, over time, they end up breeding smarter animals than what they started off with. And actually, the wargs themselves deviate into two different styles too, where the wargs on the plains are typically, they look more wolf-like, where they have a little bit more fur, which you would think the ones in the high mountains do. But actually, the fur in and of itself does not add protection to heat. It helps act as insulation between the two. So if you change between heat and cold, fur is a little bit more useful for an animal. Higher up in the elevations, it's thicker hide. So they're a little bit thicker hide. But in general, the way I look at it is my orcs, the fundamental things that like cross all orcs both species of orcs that I'm talking about, they're exceptionally durable. Nothing can take a punch in my world, at least per capita, that's not supernatural. Let me start adding a bunch of caveats here. Nothing's tougher except for these 15 things.
Yeah, right. Minotaurs are pretty tough. Bugbears.
But orcs in my world very much are they're tough fighters because they can take a punch. So they're not the best spearmen. They're not the best archers. They're not the sneakiest people out there. They're not the best at anything. They're pretty good at most things that involve combat. But the strength that they have is they are very hard to kill. It typically takes a lot more effort to kill an orc than any other creature if you're doing the damage to it.
Now, let me ask for some specifics regarding that. Does that mean just if you're physically pounding on them, they can just take a beating?
Yes.
Does that mean if you were to stab them, like, is it like they don't bleed as much, so it's harder for them to bleed out, or their wounds heal faster, or
there is no healing involved in it? The simple fact is they can tolerate a lot more pain.
Okay. And
the way their genetics are built is you're not going to quite damage them quite as much when you stab them as any other creature. They're tough. They're just physically tough. And even when they have gaping wounds, they won't act as if they have pain. Which allows them to be a little bit stronger, even though strength-wise...
A lot more intimidating, too.
A lot more intimidating because you can literally take a spear and plug it right into one's chest, and unless you get lucky and happen to really kill it in one shot, it's going to look uninjured. So there's some intimidation factor with that, where you feel like you keep beating these things, and they won't die. Like other more warlike creatures in my world, they're short-lived beings, and by short-lived I mean average human length, right? So they have shorter lifespans than like elves. But it makes the interesting thing is the way I break down age is the longer lived races are much more patient. And so they take a lot more time to do everything. The shorter lived races they think are impatient, but the advantage is they typically outgrow the longer lived races in science and what they're doing because they're trying to get stuff done because they feel the risk of mortality. Where elves that live longer don't feel that risk as nearly as strong as like humans and orcs do. But all my shorter lived races typically are much more aggressive and much more willing to start wars. But that's definitely not an absolute. I mean, there are some strands of elves that are quite nasty. But that's a different episode. Appearance, like I said, like very stocky style builds, especially in the mountain versions. The ones that go to the plains into out becoming a little lighter. So they're not, but compared to like their counterparts on horses, they're still going to look stockier. Most of them, on the plains, rarely outside of sleeping do not leave their mounts and can sleep on their mounts. So they can spend a long period of time mounted, like months, which is not uncommon for any steppe group. That's no special racial treatment. But they're not necessarily great at walking. It's just, they don't do it much.
I'm not sure I follow that one. They're not great at walking?
And it's not like even like where it'd be like a negative in game terms. It's just like their legs are bow-legged because they're mounted almost their entire life.
So they don't do a whole lot of hand-to-hand on their feet?
Not on their feet. Nope.
Really?
They'll come in. Typically, the way they'll fight is they will use bows. They will attack you at a distance. And then when you look to be rattled or broken, they will come in and they'll use spears or swords to kind of finish you off close. For the plains versions, the ones from the mountains don't have that same issue because they they do go mounted for long periods of time, but then they'll also not be mounted for long periods of time. So they kind of even out. But you start to see deviations in the races and the traits that attract people to them. So the ones on the plains are better riders. Because there's a natural selection where ones that are better riders are more attractive to the other orcs, so they're more likely to reproduce. So they're better mounted than the ones in the mountains. But the ones in the mountains have better mounts for their environment. So once again, I wouldn't want to fight either one on their own turf. Now, limitations. Orcs typically have a higher attrition due to fighting. So that, like, if you looked at like an average lifespan of an orc, it would appear shorter than a human's in the Iron Age, but that's because there's a lot more violence in their life. And when we talk more about their cultures, which we will in a later episode, especially the differences thereof, when you look at the cultures, it's more about personal strength that decries ownership. And so if you can take something from someone, if you do it in sort of a straight up way, it's not necessarily bad. And there is a variance between the mountain and the plains orcs on that. But in general, the general idea is there for both of them, where that seems to come out of their early survival, is this idea that, you can only own it if you can keep it. If you have too much stuff and you can't keep it, that's not our problem. And if we kill you to take your stuff, you weren't strong enough to keep it anyway. So it might be murder, but it's not necessarily, if it's not like a backstabbing kind of thing, depending on how exactly it went down, it probably wouldn't be a problem. Now, if you cross social class, that might get you in trouble later on as some of the plains orcs start to settle in and become their own societies. But really, I love talking about orcs, which is why we're doing this episode in the first place, obviously. The thing I want people to keep in mind is sort of a takeaway for you when you're building out your worlds, is when there's a radical change in environment, whether it's a culture or a race, what's important to survive will start to make changes. That's how new species get created. That's why you have variations in cultures from certain parts of the earth to other parts of the earth. It's because of the materials around them are radically different, so that you work with what you have. That's why you have people who've survived pretty much everywhere on Earth, but some places don't necessarily develop civilizations because they don't have a staple food source that they can grow on top of, where in most parts of the world, and the better agriculture gets, the less of a truth that becomes. So the thing to keep in mind is when you're world building, from a framework standpoint, like I like to build, or you're building something from scratch, you want to sort of pass the smell test, is sit and look at it and say, what's around this in the world? What do they need to be good at? What is unimportant? And then other things you can kind of play with. Like the build probably doesn't matter much body type wise, but I want the stockier sort of stone colored flesh in orcs because I like that. And you could maybe even argue, but I think you're starting to split hairs that, well, if they have more of a kind of granite complexion in the mountains, they'll survive better. But ultimately, that's just cheating the wheel. It doesn't really matter that much. You can put a little mud on the face to camouflage yourself out in the wilderness. So you can do things to camouflage yourself without, natural selection stepping into that part. So, so some things you got to choose on, but, the biggest thing to think about is what's the environment that people are at. And, especially very early on, what differentiates my races are the challenges they have to deal with. And for my orc startup in the mountains, it was needing to be tough because the likelihood of taking a fall is really good. So if you roll down, several hundred feet of a cliff, you need to be able to survive. The ones that can't survive that die off and don't reproduce. The ones that do survive that end up reproducing. They don't have goat feet. They're naturally attracted to the wargs because each side benefits, but it makes the orcs better in the mountains, which is why, you don't want to run into orcs in the mountains. You just don't screw with mountain orcs in my world. Plain orcs, I wouldn't want to screw with pretty much anything in my world, but especially mountain orcs in the mountains.
Just never mind. Just don't fight anybody.
Just run away. Pull a Sir Robin.
Never a good idea. Just stay away.
Yeah, but no, I think this is relatively a simple one, and I don't necessarily want to, belate it too much. But the thing is, once again, I like to think about what things look like. Physiologically, what are they built like? And to me, it's sort of stocky, but a little bit shorter humans. Traits. The major defining trait for my orcs is their toughness. And there's a little bit more to it, but it's not important. That's sort of the dominative one. And then, limitations. Because of their stockiness, their legs are a little bit shorter on average. Even an equal height human will probably be able to outrun an orc. Of course, not if the orc's on a warg, but that's why you don't like to run into orc raiding bands. But and then the warg mouth that might chomp in and chew on you too. But that's pretty much all I have for orcs today. And I want to go back into section 2 and sort of talk about from a cultural standpoint how they deviate and sort of how the cultures kind of and races sort of shape each other. Which I got into a little bit here, but I'll go into a little bit more in a later episode. So the world building task for today is I want you to go out and create an orc race. Even if you're doing one of those kind of worlds, do some research on what orcs are from mythology. And I kind of went to the modern day sort of conventional wisdom of what an orc is. But if you start back with what orcs were, you're thinking I think it's the god of the underworld in the Roman days, which led to these demon spirits. And mythologically, you could take orcs in many different directions. It's only relatively recently that they're not necessarily direct minions of hell. So I'll put some links in the episode that you can look up that stuff too. If you want to go to the show notes, go check that out. I'll take you to some links of people talking about orcs and wargs sort of via history. But that's really all I have here. And the real world task of the day.
Where is it? I'm missing it. Here we go. Share a bit about your orcs in the Fantasy World Builders Undercroft. So if you haven't joined the Undercroft yet, you should absolutely get on our Facebook page. Join the Undercroft. A great group of people. Everybody's been putting up all kinds of great stuff lately. You've got a great community. You've got a lot of resources, people bouncing ideas, people asking for help, and hopefully getting the help that they need. And I'm still not seeing a lot of this, but I would love to see people partnering up and writing together. I see a little bit of that, but not a lot.
Mm-hmm. But ultimately, if you do temporary stuff to do that, it's a great way to become better. You can work with other people, even if it's not on a permanent basis, to sit there and say, hey, let's make each other's writing better if that's where we're going, or make our world building better by collaborating, or at least from a critical standpoint where you can help make each other's work better.
Yeah, and if you really want to help Jeff out and throw him a bone for his birthday, go to www.gardul.com/Amazon and buy something for yourself. It'll help the show.
That's right.
So to help Jeff, you can buy something for yourself. Just do it through that portal.
Thank you so much for listening to the World Builders Anvil.
We would love it if you would share the World Builders Anvil with 2 of your friends.
And so would they.
If they are unfamiliar with podcasts, then you get to introduce them to the wonderful world of podcasting.
Take them to Stitcher or iTunes, or best of all, just send them to our website, www.gardul.com.
That's GARDUL.com.
Now strike while the mithril's hot.